I bought a home in the Blue Ridge Mountains so I could finally live in peace. Then my nephew called me. I'm listing your place as a rental. You can use the guest room when there aren't bookings. Be glad I'm including you. I didn't argue with him, but when he showed up with his first paying guests, they found what I'd spent weeks preparing. I want to be careful about how I tell this story because there's a version of it that makes me sound like a bitter old man who hates his family, and that's not quite right. There's another version that makes my nephew sound like a cartoon villain, and that's not right either. The truth is more ordinary than either of those, and I think the ordinary version is more useful. So let me start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the conflict, the beginning of me. I grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the second of 3 children. My father worked for the city, water and sewer department, 32 years. My mother kept a house and later, once we were old enough not to need her full attention, took a part-time position at a dry cleaner on the main road. We were not poor, but we were careful. My father had a phrase he used when one of us asked for something the budget couldn't accommodate. He'd say, "That's not in the cards this week." Not a lecture, not a guilt trip, just a statement of fact, delivered the same way you might report the weather. That's not in the cards this week. We understood what it meant and we moved on. I don't say this to romanticize a frugal childhood. I say it because I think it explains something about how I came to be the kind of person who works 31 years at the same firm, drives the same truck for 11 years, and retires with enough money to pay cash for a 12-acre property in the mountains without needing to ask anyone for anything. I was never hungry for luxury. I was hungry for options, specifically the option to one day stop trading my time for someone else's priorities and trade it for my own instead. I became a structural engineer somewhat by accident. My high school guidance counselor told me I was good at math and had the temperament for precision work. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I took the advice. Vanderbilt for undergraduate, Tennessee State for my master's. I joined a civil engineering firm in Nashville in 1989, and I stayed there until I walked out the door in 2020 with a handshake from my department head, a card signed by 17 people whose names I knew well, and 31 years of accumulated purpose that I was finally free to redirect. The work itself was not glamorous, but it was meaningful in a way I appreciated. Load-bearing systems, foundation calculations, the structural logic that holds a building upright when the wind pushes against it and the years pile on. I designed systems for hospitals, office parks, 2 parking structures, and a performing arts center in Chattanooga that I still drive past sometimes and feel a quiet, specific satisfaction looking at. It's standing. It's doing what I said it would do. That's enough. I was precise in my work. I was patient in my personal life. I was married once, briefly, in my early 30s, to a woman named Carol who was warm and funny and ultimately wanted things I couldn't give her. Specifically, a husband who was home more and cared less about getting the calculations right the first time. We parted without bitterness in 1998. I have been alone since, mostly by choice, and the aloneness has never bothered me the way people always seem to expect it should. What I wanted, at the end of all of it, was quiet. Not emptiness. Quiet. There is a difference. Emptiness is the absence of something. Quiet is the presence of exactly what you chose to put there and nothing else. I started looking for the property in early 2019, a year before I planned to retire. I knew what I wanted with unusual specificity. Western North Carolina, because I'd done a fishing trip there in 2003 and never quite gotten it out of my system. Acreage, because I wanted the buffer of space between myself and the next person. A creek, if possible, because there is something about moving water that I find genuinely settling in a way I can't fully explain and have stopped trying to. 3 bedrooms, because a man who lives alone still needs a place to put guests that isn't his own bed. I found the property in late 2019 after 8 months of looking. It's outside a small town in a county that most people in North Carolina haven't heard of, which suited me perfectly. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch with a view of a ridge to the south and a valley to the west. 12 acres of mixed hardwood, oak, hickory, tulip, poplar, with an understory of rhododendron along the eastern edge that I had been told was spectacular in late spring. A creek along the eastern property line that runs cold and clear even in August when the rest of the region tends toward dry. The asking price was $412,000. I offered $387,000 and they took it. I paid cash, no mortgage, no co-signers, no monthly obligation to any bank or institution or person. The deed has my name on it, and only my name, and when the closing attorney slid it across the table for my signature, I took a moment before I picked up the pen, not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to register the moment properly. I moved in on a Tuesday in October of 2020. The trees were turning. The air had that particular mountain quality, thin and cool and carrying wood smoke from somewhere to the north that I remembered from the 2003 fishing trip and had been quietly thinking about ever since. The first evening, I made a cup of coffee, carried it to the east end of the porch, and sat in the camp chair I'd set there while the movers were still unloading the last of the furniture. The fog was settling into the valley below. The creek was audible if I held still. The ridge to the south was going gold, then copper, then the particular dark blue that mountains turn in the last 20 minutes before full dark. I sat there until I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. That was the life I had worked 31 years to purchase. Not the house, not the acreage. That specific evening, on that specific porch, with no one needing anything from me and nowhere to be the next morning. That was the thing. I should have known it wouldn't stay uncontested for long. My sister's name is Patricia. She She is 4 years younger than me and has lived in Charlotte for the better part of 2 decades. Patricia is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, because the story that follows could easily make her sound like one, and the reality is more complicated. Patricia has a way of treating the resources of people she loves as loosely communal, not out of greed exactly, more like a deep and long-standing assumption that closeness entitles her to proximity, and proximity entitles her to access. When our mother passed and left me her china cabinet, a solid mahogany piece that had been in the family for 40 years, Patricia was in my driveway within the week to ask if I really needed it. She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely believed that because she wanted it and I had it and we were family, that was a reasonable conversation to be having. I kept the cabinet. I mention this only to establish that I have practiced saying no to Patricia, and that the practice has not damaged our relationship in any permanent way. Patricia has one son. His name is Derek, and he is 34 years old. Derek is the kind of young man who has spent his entire adult life in pursuit of the deal that will change everything. Not in an anxious way, in a genuinely confident way, which is in some respects more concerning, because it means the failures don't recalibrate him the way failures are supposed to. He absorbs them, shakes them off, and pivots to the next thing with the same enthusiasm he brought to the one before. The food truck lasted 11 months. It was a Korean-Mexican fusion concept in Charlotte, and from everything I heard, the food was genuinely good. The problem, as best I could piece together from Derek's version of events, was that the margins on food trucks are punishing, and the hours are brutal, and he had not fully internalized either of those facts before he signed the lease on the truck. The app was something about local event discovery. I am not the target demographic for local event discovery apps, so I can't speak to its merits. It lasted about 8 months before the funding ran out. The drop shipping venture I understood better, because Derek explained it to me twice in detail, once at Christmas and once on the phone in March of whatever year that was. The concept was sound in principle. The execution involved a supplier in Guangzhou whose quality control was inconsistent and a return rate that eventually consumed the margin. 14 months. The cryptocurrency thing I declined to have explained a second time. I understood the broad strokes. Something about a platform, something about facilitating transactions, something about early adoption advantage. I nodded. I said that sounded interesting. I moved on. Derek is charming. I want to be fair about this. He is genuinely, naturally charming in a way that I, a man who spent 3 decades doing load calculations, am not and have never been. He has good teeth and an easy laugh and a quality of attention that makes you feel, while he's talking to you, like you are the most interesting person in the room. He has his mother's warmth and something else, some instinct for reading people's soft spots that I suspect is entirely his own. He makes his ideas sound like your ideas. I have watched him do this to other people for years. I told myself I was immune. As it turned out, I was not as immune as I believed. Derek called me in February of 2021, about 4 months after I moved into the North Carolina house. I remember the call clearly because I was on the porch when it came in. Unusual for February, but we'd had a warm stretch that week and I was taking advantage of it. The ridge was still bare, the leaves not yet back, and you could see the topography of the mountain in a way that the summer growth conceals. I had my coffee, and I was watching a pair of red-tailed hawks work the thermals above the valley. The call started the way Derek's calls always start, with warmth and apparent genuine interest. How was I settling in? Was the mountain air everything I'd hoped? Had I found a good hardware store in town? Because in his experience, knowing the right hardware store was genuinely essential in a rural area, and a lot of people underestimated it. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked about the creek, about the neighbors, about whether I'd gotten my wood supply sorted for the winter. He asked if I was cooking or eating out mostly. He sounded interested. The questions were good questions. I remember thinking, and this is the part that embarrasses me slightly in retrospect, I remember thinking that it was nice that he'd called. Then, with a casualness that I can now recognize as studied, he mentioned that he'd been doing a lot of research lately into the short-term rental market. I said that was interesting. He said the mountain region of North Carolina had emerged as one of the top vacation rental markets in the entire Southeast. Strong year-round demand, low supply of quality properties relative to that demand, premium pricing on weekends and holidays, significant additional premium during leaf season, which, he noted, in my specific area ran roughly from mid-October through early November and commanded rates that would surprise me. I said that was interesting too, and I meant it, but in the way you mean something interesting when you have no intention of acting on it. He said a property like mine, private, wooded, acreage, a creek, that wraparound porch, was exactly what the market was hungry for. He said comparable properties within 20 miles were booking at rates that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. He threw out a number, $50,000, maybe $55,000 a year, with proper management and dynamic pricing. I said that was a substantial number. He said it was, and the best part, and this was where the real pitch began, though I didn't recognize it quite yet, the best part was that I wouldn't need to manage any of it myself. He had researched the operational side extensively. He had connections with a cleaning service. He understood the platform algorithms and how to position a listing for maximum visibility. He knew how to price dynamically, lower on weekdays, premium on weekends, aggressive during leaf season and holiday weekends. He'd handle the guest communication, the check-ins, the turnovers, all of it. All I would need to do, he said, was make myself available to relocate to the smaller guest room during bookings. I want to pause on that sentence for a moment because I think about it often. All I would need to do in my own house. The house I bought with 31 years of accumulated savings. The house whose deed carries only my name. The house I purchased specifically so that I would have a place in the world where I owed no one anything and no one's schedule touched mine. All I would need to do was make myself available to relocate. In that house, at the convenience of paying strangers my nephew had solicited. I told him no. I said it clearly and without ambiguity or softening. I said I had bought this house to live in it quietly, and that was what I intended to do. I said I wasn't interested in having strangers cycle through on weekends. I said I appreciated that he was thinking creatively, but the answer was no. He said he understood completely. He said he respected that. He said we'd talk soon. The Hawks were still working the thermals when I hung up. I watched them for a while and didn't think too much of it. He called again 3 weeks later. This time he came with numbers. He'd apparently spent the intervening period building out a proper spreadsheet, and he walked me through it with the patience of a man who has convinced himself that resistance is simply a failure of information. He'd pulled comparable listings within a 20-mile radius and calculated average nightly rates by season. He'd factored in a conservative occupancy estimate, 65% annually, which he said was below the market average for properties of this type. He'd deducted a management fee and cleaning costs. He'd accounted for the platform's service charge. The net projection came to $52,000 annually for me after his cut. He said the acreage alone was a differentiating amenity. Properties with significant land commanded a premium because guests felt the privacy in a way they didn't with standard mountain cabins. He said the creek was a natural feature that top-performing listings in the region consistently highlighted. He'd seen listings where the creek was mentioned in the title, in the first line of the description, in the photo captions. I said the creek was one of the reasons I bought the property. He said exactly, which was why it was almost a waste to keep it to myself. I told him the money on the table was fine where it was. He laughed. He said he knew I was joking because what retired person wouldn't want supplemental income at that level? He said, what if something happened? What if I had a health situation? What if the roof needed replacing and it cost more than I'd budgeted? He was just trying to help me think ahead. I told him I had thought ahead for 31 years. That was how I bought the house. The answer was still no. He said he understood. He said the offer stood. We hung up. I mentioned the calls to Patricia the next time we talked, which was a week or so later. I wasn't angry. I mentioned it the way you mention something you want someone to know, on the assumption that a mother, informed that her son has been persistently pitching an unwanted business proposal to her brother, will tell that son to stop. Patricia laughed. She said Derek just had a good eye for opportunity. She said he was enthusiastic, and I shouldn't be so resistant to new ideas. She did not say she would tell him to stop. I noted this. I did not say anything about it at the time. The third call came in February. By this point, it had been roughly 5 months since I'd moved in, and something in Derek's tone had shifted. He wasn't pitching anymore. He was informing. He said he had done some additional research and determined that the optimal structure for an arrangement would be a formal partnership. He would handle all operations. I would provide the property. We would split the revenue. He proposed 60% for him, 40% for me. The basis for this split, he explained, was that his labor and expertise were the primary value drivers. The property itself was, in his framing, the raw material, necessary but passive. The active ingredient was his management skill. I let him finish. Then I asked him to repeat the percentages. He repeated them. 60 for him, 40 for me, for the use of my property that I owned. I said, Derek, I've told you no 3 times now. This is the last time I'm going to say it. Not through you, not through anyone, not in any structure or percentage configuration you devise. Please do not bring this up again. He said he was sorry I felt that way. He said he thought I'd come around eventually. He said the offer stood whenever I was ready. I hung up. That, I believed, would be the end of it. I was wrong. In March, my neighbor Roy mentioned that he'd seen a car parked at my place over the previous weekend. Roy is a retired postal worker who lives 2 parcels over on the same road. He walks his beagle, an old, deliberate animal named something I can never quite catch, past my fence line most mornings. We had developed the kind of easy friendship that rural neighbors develop when both parties value their privacy equally, and neither one is inclined to intrude. A wave from the road, an occasional exchange at the fence about the weather or the deer population or the state of the gravel on the shared stretch of driveway easement. He mentioned it in passing, the way you mention something a neighbor probably already knows but possibly doesn't. He thought I should know. He described the car. It was Derek's car. I had been in Asheville that weekend, visiting a college friend named David. I had been gone from Friday afternoon through Sunday evening. My house had been sitting empty. I drove back up the driveway when I got home that Sunday and walked the perimeter of the property. Nothing was disturbed, no windows broken, no locks forced, but something had been here, and the something had been my nephew, and he had not had my permission and had not announced his intention and had not said a word about it on any of the 3 calls. I called him from the porch. He answered on the second ring, cheerful. I asked him directly why his car had been at my property the previous weekend. He said he'd just driven up to take some photos for his own planning purposes. Nothing serious. I asked what photos. He said exterior shots, the porch, the view from the front yard, the creek. He said the listing would need good photos if we were ever going to move forward, and he wanted to get a sense of what the light was like at different times of day. I told told him that was trespassing. He said I was being dramatic. He said he was family. I said the two things were not mutually exclusive. He laughed. That laugh. I have thought about that laugh many times since. It is not a mean laugh. It's not contemptuous exactly. It's indulgent in the specific way that some people reserve for interactions with children or the very old when they've decided that the upset is disproportionate and the correct response is patient amusement. It's the laugh of a person who has already decided that your objection doesn't count and is waiting for you to figure that out. I did not laugh back. I hung up and made 3 phone calls. The first was to a locksmith in town, a man I'd used twice before for minor issues and found competent and discreet. I told him I needed every lock on the property rekeyed and upgraded. The front door got a deadbolt that requires a physical key on both sides. The back door got the same. The door from the attached storage area to the main house got a new lock entirely, a heavy-duty deadbolt I'd found on the hardware store's website that the store owner, when I described what I was looking for, called serious business in a tone I took as a compliment. I ordered a steel lockbox for the exterior breaker panel. I wasn't sure what I expected anyone to do with breaker access, but the locksmith mentioned it as a vulnerability, and I saw no reason not to close it. The second call was to a security company out of Asheville. I had cameras installed at every entry point, front door, back door, both sides of the driveway, and one additional camera covering the parking area near the old barn at the edge of the property where Derek's car had apparently been sitting while he photographed my house without my knowledge. The feed routes to my phone. Motion triggers a notification. I can see every corner of my property in real time from wherever I am. I tested this the day after installation by walking around the perimeter at midnight to see how the night vision performed. It performed well. The third call was to an attorney in Asheville who specializes in property and real estate law. I found him through the County Bar Association's referral service, which, if you ever need a specialist in a region you're not familiar with, is a more reliable method than most people realize. I explained the situation to him in full. He asked several careful questions. He told me to document everything going forward, dates, times, the content of every conversation, ideally in writing to myself immediately after it happened. He told me to send Derek a formal written notice stating that he was not permitted on the property without my explicit prior consent, that any future violation would be treated as trespassing and reported to the sheriff's department, and that any attempt to represent himself as having any authority over the property in any commercial capacity would be addressed legally. He drafted the letter. It was precise and unambiguous in the way that good legal writing is. No flourish, no emotion, just a clear statement of rights and consequences. I signed it. It went out certified mail. My nephew signed for it. I did not tell Patricia any of this, not because I was trying to hide it, but because I had reached a conclusion about what her involvement would produce, and the conclusion was nothing useful, the paperwork phase. I want to describe this carefully, because it's the part of the story that people always want to understand, and it's also the part that took the most deliberate thought. After the locks and the cameras and the attorney's letter, I sat on the porch one evening in late March and thought through the situation from a structural perspective. I am an engineer by training and temperament, and when I face a problem that feels intractable, I default to first principles thinking. What is actually possible here? What conditions would have to be in place for the bad outcome to occur? What can I put in place to make those conditions impossible rather than merely discouraged? The bad outcome I was modeling was this. Derek lists my property on a vacation rental platform without my knowledge or consent. Guests show up believing they have a legitimate reservation. I am faced with a confrontation on my own front porch that is, at minimum, deeply unpleasant and at maximum, legally complicated. The discouragement approach, the attorney's letter, the certified mail, the documented no, addressed the moral and legal reality of the situation. Derek would be in the wrong. I would have a paper trail. If it came to a legal proceeding, my position would be solid. But discouragement was not the same as prevention. A person who had already driven to my property, photographed it without permission, and pitched me a revenue split after I'd said no 3 times was not, I had concluded, a person who would be reliably discouraged by a certified letter. The certified letter would be evidence. It was not a wall. I needed a wall. The wall came in 2 parts. The first part, a short-term rental permit application filed with the county, in my name only. Our township, like many rural townships in western North Carolina, has in recent years implemented short-term rental regulations in response to the growth of vacation platform listings. The regulations vary by county, but in our specific jurisdiction, the requirements include a property owner attestation, notarized with a government-issued ID, confirming that the property owner consents to the rental use and that the property meets certain safety and habitability standards. The permit is tied to the property address. Without a valid permit on file, a listing at that address is in violation of the county code. I applied for the permit in my own name with my own notarized attestation, and in the notes section of the application, I indicated that I had become aware of potential unauthorized rental activity associated with my address and requested that the county notify me directly of any compliance inquiries or flags associated with the property. I also asked through my attorney that the county establish a protocol with the major vacation platforms to flag any listing at my address that was not associated with a permit issued in my name. My attorney attorney made the parallel contact with the platform's trust and safety department. He provided documentation of my sole ownership, the deed, the closing statement, a utility bill in my name, a sworn statement regarding the unauthorized contact I'd experienced, and flagged my property address as one that might appear in an unauthorized listing. He requested that the platform's team contact him directly if any such listing appeared. The second part of the wall was simpler. I gave the sheriff's department the booking dates. My security cameras, it turned out, had captured Derek on my property on 2 separate occasions after the certified letter was delivered. He'd come back. I had footage of his car in the driveway, footage of him walking the property with his phone in his hand, footage of him standing on my porch looking through the windows. I had not known in real time. The notification system works, but I'd been inside with the sound off both times and hadn't seen the alerts until later. By then, he was gone. But the footage existed. I gave the dates, times, and footage stills to the deputy who took my statement. She was thorough and professional and told me, without any particular surprise in her voice, that she'd been seeing more of this type of situation lately. The listing went live on a Saturday in April. I found out when my phone lit up with a motion alert from the driveway camera at 2:47 in the afternoon. I was in the kitchen making lunch. I looked at the feed and saw an unfamiliar SUV, late model, dark green, out-of-state plates, rolling slowly down my gravel driveway. I set down the knife and walked to the front door. The SUV parked in the area near the old barn. 2 people got out, a man and a woman. Both appeared to be in their mid-30s, both dressed for a mountain weekend. Good outdoor gear, the kind that signals this is a leisure trip they've planned and are looking forward to. The woman had a rolling suitcase. The man was looking at his phone. When they saw me standing on the porch, they stopped. The man walked toward me and I could see from 20 feet away that he was confused in the particular way of someone who has a confirmation number but is encountering a discrepancy. He said they were here for the check-in. I said, "I beg your pardon." He said they had a reservation. He held up his phone. I looked at the screen. My house, my property address, correct down to the rural route number. Photos I recognized immediately. My porch, my front yard, the view of the ridge from the east side of the property, the creek bend where the water pools before the narrows. Derek's photos. 3-night booking at $420 per night. Check-in listed as 3 o'clock that afternoon. The woman had come up beside him. She was looking at me with a kind of cautious politeness, the look of someone who senses something is wrong but doesn't yet know what. I told them, as calmly as I could manage, that there had been a serious error. I told them that I had never listed this property on any rental platform and that whoever had created this listing had done so without my knowledge or consent. I told them that I was very sorry for the inconvenience, and I meant that sincerely because they had done nothing wrong and were being caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with them, and that they would not be able to stay here. I told them to contact the platform for a full refund, and to tell the platform when they made that contact that the listing was fraudulent. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So there's no house to rent?" I said, "This is my house, and I never listed it." The woman looked at her husband, then back at me, then down at her suitcase. She said they'd driven 4 hours. I said I was sorry. I said it again because I meant it again. They were upset, which was entirely fair. They backed out of the driveway slowly, the woman on her phone already, and I stood on the porch and watched them go. Then I went inside and called my attorney. He was not surprised. He said, "This is what I was concerned about." He said, "We have good documentation." He said, "Sit tight and let me work." The platform response was faster than I expected. My attorney contacted them within the hour with the package he had been preparing since March. Deed, closing statement, sworn affidavit, documentation of the unauthorized access, the security camera footage dates, the attorney's letter, and the signed return receipt from the certified mail. He notified them that the listing was fraudulent, that the property owner had never authorized any rental use, and that the account holder had collected deposits on future bookings for a property they did not own. The listing was taken down within 48 hours. The platform provided my attorney with records of the account that had created the listing, Derek's name, Derek's contact information, and the bank account designated to receive payments. He had already collected deposits on 3 future bookings, in addition to the couple who had driven 4 hours and arrived at my porch with a rolling suitcase and a confirmation number. The couple from the driveway got a full refund within 24 hours of making their complaint. I know this because the woman emailed the address I'd given her to let me know they'd been taken care of. She said she hoped I got the situation sorted out. She was gracious about it in a way I found genuinely touching, given the circumstances. The sheriff's department had their own follow-up with Derek based on the trespassing complaint and the camera footage. I was not privy to the details of that conversation, but the deputy who had taken my initial statement called me afterward to tell me the matter had been addressed. My attorney filed for a civil injunction preventing Derek from representing himself as having any authority over my property in any commercial or personal capacity, from listing it, from photographing it for commercial purposes, from accepting money in connection with it, from making any representation to any third party that he had rights over it. The injunction was granted quickly, in fact so quickly that I mentioned it to my attorney, and he said, without inflection, the facts were clear. Derek called me the evening after the injunction was served. I knew it was him before I looked at the screen. I let it ring once, then answered. His voice was different. The easiness was gone, the good teeth and the easy laugh. Those are telephone qualities too, and they were absent. His voice voice was tight in the way that voices get when someone is working to keep anger from becoming something they'll regret. He said I had overreacted. He said he had been trying to help me. He said I had embarrassed him and caused him real financial damage, and that he didn't understand why I had gone to these extremes when we were family. I let him finish. I waited a few seconds to be sure he was done. Then I said, I told you no. I said, I told you clearly, multiple times, beginning with the first phone call in February, continuing through the second call and the third call and the conversation about the trespassing. I sent you a certified letter. You signed for it. You came back to my property after signing for it. You photographed my house again. You listed my property on a commercial platform without my knowledge. You accepted money from strangers for the use of a house that is not yours. I said, you had every opportunity to stop. At any of those moments, you could have stopped. You did not. I said, so I stopped you. He said he had thought I would eventually agree. He said he'd been operating on the assumption that the NOS were negotiating positions, not final answers. I said, hope is not authorization. There was a pause. Then he said that I had ruined something he'd spent months building. I said, you built it on my property without asking me. That's not something I ruined. That's something you built in the wrong place. He hung up. Patricia called me that evening, about 2 hours later. She did not sound like a woman calling to check on her brother. She sounded like a woman who had spent 2 hours on the phone with her son and was now calling me on his behalf, which is what she was doing. She told me Derek was devastated. She told me that what I had done was excessive, that I had involved lawyers and police over a business idea, that I had humiliated her son and damaged his reputation over something that could have been worked out between family members like adults. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question. I said, when I told you in January that Derek was pushing this and you told me he just had a good eye for opportunity, did you tell him to stop? She was quiet. I said, I told him no in February. I told him no in the second call. I told him no in the third call. I told you about the calls in January and you told me he was enthusiastic. I sent him a certified letter. He came back to my property anyway. He photographed it anyway. He listed it anyway. He took money for it. I said, I did not make this complicated. He made it complicated, and you had a chance, a real chance in January to make it stop, and you chose not to. She said I could have handled it differently. She said I could have been more patient. She said family was supposed to find ways to work things out. I asked how many times she thought I should have said no before it counted. She didn't have an answer for that. We haven't spoken since. That is her choice, and I have respected it by not pushing. The door is open. I have no interest in a permanent rupture over this, but I also have no interest in pretending that my patience was the variable that failed here, because it wasn't. There is a thing I have been thinking about since all of this settled. My work for 31 years was about the relationship between structure and load. A structure is only as good as the assumptions built into its design. You calculate for the expected loads, the weight of the building itself, the occupancy, the environmental forces, wind and snow and seismic, and then you add a safety factor because the world is not perfectly predictable and responsible engineering accounts for that. The safety factor is not pessimism. It is not a statement that the building is bad or that the expected loads will exceed estimates. It is an acknowledgement that reality has edges you cannot always see in advance, and that the cost of being wrong without a margin is catastrophic, while the cost of the safety factor itself is modest. What Derek was proposing, underneath all the spreadsheets and the market research and the 60-40 split, was that I remove my safety factor, that I take the thing I had built my adult life around, autonomy, the right to occupy my own space on my own terms, and expose it to loads I had not calculated for and could not control. He framed this as an opportunity. In structural terms, it was a proposal to eliminate the margin. I've spent 31 years telling clients that the margin is not optional. It's the part that protects you from what you didn't think to plan for. You don't give it away because someone shows you a spreadsheet. Roy asked me a few weeks after everything settled how things had shaken out. I gave him the short version, enough to explain the activity he'd seen, not so much that I was making it a longer story than it needed to be. He nodded slowly, the way he does, and said, some people only understand a thing once it costs them something. He said it without satisfaction, just as an observation, the same way my father used to say that's not in the cards this week. A statement of fact about the way the world works, delivered without drama. I thought it was about the most accurate thing I'd heard said about the whole business. It is June now. The rhododendrons bloomed in late May, heavy clusters of pink that run for nearly 200 feet along the eastern fence line, where the land drops toward the creek. I have walked through them every morning for the past week simply because I can, because there is no one needing me back inside, because the morning belongs entirely to me, and so do the next one and the one after that. The creek is running high from the spring rains. There is a bend about 40 yards east of the fence where the water pools before the narrows, and in the mornings when the air is still, the sound of it carries all the way to the porch. I have taken to sitting with my coffee on that east end of the porch and doing nothing in particular for 30 minutes before I start the day. Not reading, not listening to anything, just sitting with the sound of the water and the birds coming in and out of the understory and the occasional red-tailed hawk working the thermals over the valley. This is not nothing. I want to be clear about that. This is not absence. This is the thing I was building toward for 31 years. The right to sit still in a place I chose, on a morning I own, with nothing asked of me and nothing owed. I repainted the porch railing last weekend. It took all of Saturday and part of Sunday morning. morning. The previous owners had painted it a white that had yellowed slightly, and the wood underneath, when I sanded it back, turned out to be in better shape than I'd expected. Solid, dry, no rot anywhere along the rail or the balusters. I used a semi-gloss in a warm gray that the man at the hardware store suggested when I described what I was going for. He has been remarkably helpful over the past 8 months, in the way that hardware store proprietors in small towns sometimes are. He knows what people are actually doing, not just what they're buying, and his suggestions tend to be good. When I finished the railing, I stood back and looked at it for a while. It looked right. It looked like something done properly, on my own schedule, with no deadline and no deliverable and no one waiting on the result except me. The injunction remains in place. Derek has not contacted me. I understand from a cousin on Patricia's side, a woman named Louise, who has always been sensible and keeps me loosely informed without taking sides, that Derek has a new venture in the works. I don't know what it is. I find that I genuinely wish him a version of success that doesn't require the use of anything that belongs to someone else. That is not sarcasm. I mean it. Roy walks his beagle past the fence most mornings around 8. Some mornings we talk for a few minutes. Some mornings we just wave. He is good company in the specific way of a person who understands that companionship and conversation are not the same thing, and doesn't confuse the two. I have a lunch twice a month in Asheville with David, the college friend I was visiting when Derek photographed my house without permission. We eat at a place near the river that does a good trout and a better bourbon selection than you'd expect. We talk about things that have nothing to do with property law or family grievances. Books, fishing, the state of the rivers, the particular way that getting older clarifies certain things you spent decades confusing. Last week, David asked me if I had any regrets about how it all played out. I thought about it for a moment, not performing deliberation, actually thinking. I said, I have no regrets about any decision I made. I have some regret that it was necessary to make them. He nodded and we ordered another round, and that was sufficient. The fog settles into the valley most evenings around 6. I pour my coffee, decaf now, which I resisted for 2 years and have since accepted as not the defeat I believed it would be, and carry it to the east end of the porch. I sit in the same camp chair I sat there on the first evening, the one I've never moved because it's in exactly the right position, and there is no reason to move a thing that is in exactly the right position. The ridge to the south goes gold, then copper, then that dark blue that mountains turn in the last 20 minutes before full dark. The creek is audible if the wind is right. Some evenings Roy passes with his beagle and we wave. Some evenings I go inside and read. Some evenings I just sit there while the light changes and think about nothing in particular, which is itself a skill I've had to relearn. The capacity to be present in a quiet moment without the part of my brain that spent 31 years solving problems reaching for something to calculate. I am getting better at it. The mornings through the rhododendrons help. I built a career out of understanding what structures are designed to bear and what they're not. I know how to read a load. I know what a safety factor is for. I know that the margin you protect is the margin that protects you when something you didn't plan for shows up in the driveway with a rolling suitcase and a confirmation number. Nobody rented a single night of it. The property is mine. The creek is mine. The fog in the valley and the dark blue on the ridge and the 30 minutes every morning with just the water and the birds, mine. I worked 31 years for this porch and this light and this silence. I have spent approximately 8 months defending it from a nephew with a spreadsheet and an indulgent laugh. The defense is over. The silence is back. It sounds, in the evenings, like exactly what I paid for.